Consider for a moment a single fact and let it settle slowly in your mind as you begin to drift. One king of ancient Egypt, in a single lifetime, moved more stone than any pharaoh who ever lived. Not the king who built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the most famous monument on earth. Not the king whose golden mask fills the museums. A king who came before them both. A king most people have never heard of. He raised not one great pyramid, but three, and perhaps more, and together they contained more stone than the Great Pyramid itself. He moved mountains of it, millions of tons of it across the desert, and stacked it toward the sky, again and again, across a reign that may have lasted longer than most men of his age lived at all. And when it was over, he had changed the shape of the world. He had invented, through patience and failure and a refusal to stop, the true pyramid, the smooth-sided mountain of stone that would become the most recognizable shape ever built by human hands. His name was Sneferu, and though his son would become far more famous, though the pyramid his son built would draw the eyes of the whole world for 4,500 years, it was Sneferu, the father, who made it all possible. It was Sneferu who learned how to build a mountain. It was Sneferu who failed and failed again, and then succeeded, and in succeeding opened the door to the greatest age of building the ancient world would ever see. The Great Pyramid of Giza could not have existed without him. The whole golden age of the pyramids flowed from his reign, from his workshops, from the lessons written into his three great monuments in the desert. He was the founder of the fourth dynasty, the dynasty that would raise Giza. He was the father of the Pyramid Age, and he has been standing all this time in the shadow of his own son tonight. We are going to bring him out of that shadow. We are going to tell the full story of Sneferu, the man who built mountains. Not the story of a single monument, but the story of a life, where he came from, how he rose to the throne, the kingdom he inherited, and the far greater kingdom he left behind, the wife who stood beside him, the son who would surpass him, the armies he sent to the frontiers, the ships he sailed to distant coasts, and above all the extraordinary, patient, stubborn genius with which he taught a whole civilization how to build in stone on a scale never before imagined. We are going to walk through his three great pyramids and read in them the story of a man learning, by trial and error, to do something no one had ever done. And we are going to ask what kind of person he was. This king remembered, for thousands of years after his death, not as a tyrant, not as a conqueror, but as something rarer and gentler, a good king, a beneficent king, a maker of beautiful things. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Sneferu really was, how a man of uncertain birth came to found the greatest dynasty of the Old Kingdom, how he moved more stone than any pharaoh in history, how he turned the stepped pyramids of the past into the true smooth pyramids of the future. Through a process of failure and correction, we can still read in the desert today how he filled his kingdom with soldiers and ships and turquoise and cedar, how his family became the royal line that built Giza, and why more than 1,000 years after he died, the Egyptians still spoke his name with warmth, remembering his reign as a golden age. You will understand why the collapsed tower at Midam, the strange bent pyramid at Dashur, and the great red pyramid beside it are not three separate wonders, but three chapters of a single story. The story of one man learning to build a mountain, and you will understand why the father, and not only the son, deserves to be remembered. This is a story about ambition, but it is also a story about patience, about a king who was willing to fail, in public, in stone, on a scale that could never be hidden, and to learn from that failure and to try again until he got it right. There are few better stories to carry you gently down toward sleep, for it is, in the end, a story of a man who kept building calmly and steadily, through failure and success alike, across a long and peaceful reign, until he had reshaped the world. There is something deeply restful in that, in the image of a king who did not rage against his failures, but studied them and corrected them, and built on until the smooth white pyramids rose perfect against the desert sky. So let us go back, slowly across 4,500 years, to the dawn of the age of pyramids. Let the modern world fade away, the way the light fades from the desert at the end of the day. Let the centuries roll back past the Great Pyramid of Giza, which had not yet been built, past the famous names of later Egypt, all the way to a kingdom still young, where a new king is about to take the throne, and to begin the greatest building program the world had ever seen. We are going to follow him from the beginning, from his uncertain birth, through his rise to power, through the 3 great mountains he raised, to the golden memory he left behind. Think, for a moment, about how rare this makes him. Most of the famous names of ancient Egypt are remembered for a single thing: a golden mask, a great tomb, a war, a mystery. Sneferu is remembered for a lifetime of making, and the making was not easy, and it was not always successful. Somewhere in the desert stands a pyramid of his that appears to have partly collapsed, its outer layers slumped into a great mound of rubble around a bare stone tower. That failure is still there, still visible. 4,500 years later, most rulers would have hidden such a thing, or torn it down, or never spoken of it. Sneferu, it seems, simply learned from it, and moved on, and built again, better. And the pyramid he built next, and the one after that, show the marks of that learning, the careful corrections, the changed angles, the growing mastery. To follow Sneferu's reign is to watch a human being solve, in real time and in solid stone, one of the hardest engineering problems anyone had ever attempted, and to watch him solve it not in a single flash of genius, but slowly, patiently, through trial and error and honest failure, is one of the most quietly moving things in all of ancient history. And there is something else that draws us to him, something gentler still. For all his mountains of stone, for all his armies and his ships and his power, Sneferu was remembered. Above everything, as kind later, Egyptians told stories of him as an approachable king, a king you could speak to, a king who treated even his servants and his magicians with a certain warmth. In an age of absolute rulers, in a civilization that saw its kings as sacred and set apart, Sneferu came down through memory as something unusual, a great king who was also a good man. Whether that memory is wholly true we cannot know, for memory softens and idealizes across 1,000 years, but that this is how he was remembered, as good, as beneficent, as beautiful in his deeds, tells us something real about the mark he left. He built the largest monuments of his age, and he was loved for it. That is a rare combination, and it is worth a night's reflection. So tonight, we will follow the whole arc of it: the uncertain birth, the careful marriage, the long reign, the 3 great mountains, the armies and the ships, the family that would build Giza, and the golden memory that outlived him by 1,000 years and more. We will move slowly, without hurry, letting each part of the story settle before we move to the next, in the calm and drifting way that suits the late hour. There is no need to hold on to every name and every date. Let the story carry you, the way the Nile carried the great stone barges toward the building sites, slowly and steadily, under a wide and ancient sky. Before we begin, if you find ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like the video or subscribe. It is a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand Sneferu, we must first stand in the world he was born into, and it was a world already old in its own eyes, already rich with tradition, already astonishing in its achievements, and yet still only at the threshold of its greatest age. So let us go there, slowly in the mind, to Egypt some 4,600 years ago, in the early centuries of what we call the Old Kingdom, at the very start of the age that would raise the pyramids. Picture the land itself, for the land is where every Egyptian story begins. Imagine a vast desert, red and gold and empty, stretching farther than the eye can see in every direction, one of the driest, harshest places on the face of the earth. And through that desert, from the deep south to the northern sea, runs a single ribbon of green, the valley of the Nile, the great river that made Egypt possible. Every year, in the heat of summer, the river rose and spilled over its banks, spreading a layer of dark, rich mud across the fields, and then withdrew, leaving the soil renewed and ready for planting. On that thin green thread of watered land, in the midst of the immense desert, the Egyptians built one of the first and greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Everything they had, their food, their wealth, their very existence depended on the river and its yearly flood. And the king, above all, was the figure they believed held that order together, the guardian of the balance between the green land and the red, between the fertile valley and the deadly desert. By the time Sneferu was born, this civilization was already ancient. The two lands of Egypt, the long narrow valley of the south, and the wide flat delta of the north, had been united into a single kingdom centuries before. By the first kings whose names survive, generations of pharaohs had already come and gone. Writing had been in use for centuries. The great capital city at the meeting of the two lands, the city we know by its later name of Memphis, was already a center of power and craft and administration. And on the desert plateaus above the valley, the dead of Egypt were already buried in their tombs, the nobles and officials, in low rectangular tombs of mud brick that we call mastabas. And the kings, by now, in something far grander. For only a generation or two before Sneferu, a king named Djoser had done something that had never been done before. He had built, on the desert plateau at a place we call Saqqara, a mountain of stone, the first pyramid, the step pyramid, a monument that rose in 6 great tiers toward the sky, the earliest colossal building of cut stone anywhere in the world. It was designed by a brilliant servant named Imhotep, and it changed everything. Before Djoser, kings had been buried under low mud-brick tombs. After Djoser, the king's tomb was a mountain, but it was a stepped mountain, a staircase of stone, built in great receding tiers, one stacked upon the next. It was magnificent, but it was not yet the smooth-sided pyramid that the world would come to know. That final form, the true pyramid, had not yet been imagined. It would take another king, and a great deal of trial and error, to reach it. That king was Sneferu. So this was the world Sneferu inherited, a wealthy, ordered, ancient kingdom, at peace with itself, that had recently learned to build in stone on a colossal scale, but that had not yet perfected the pyramid. The stepped pyramids of the Third Dynasty stood on the desert as proof of what was possible. The workshops knew how to quarry and move great blocks of stone. The administration knew how to gather and feed and direct thousands of workers. Everything was in place for a great leap forward. Everything except the final idea, the true pyramid, and the king with the patience and the vision to reach it. Into that moment, at that threshold, Sneferu was born. Now let us turn to the man himself, as far as the evidence allows us to know him, and here, at once, we meet the mystery that surrounds his origins. For we do not know, with certainty, who Sneferu's father was. He came to the throne as the founder of a new dynasty, the fourth, and the king before him, the last king of the Third Dynasty, was a ruler named Huni. Many have supposed that Huni was Sneferu's father. But the evidence is not clear, and some scholars doubt it. What seems more likely from the traces that survive is that Sneferu was the son of Huni by a lesser wife, a queen named Mirasank, whose name comes down to us as his possible mother, rather than the son of the principal queen. If so, then Sneferu was royal, but not the most obvious heir. A prince, but perhaps not first in line. And this may be why he did something that many Egyptian kings did to secure a contested claim. He married the royal heiress, a princess named Hetepheres, who is believed to have been the daughter of King Huni by his principal wife. By marrying her, Sneferu joined his own royal blood to the most senior line of the previous dynasty and secured his right to the throne. It was a union that would shape the whole future of Egypt, for from it, or from Sneferu's line, would come the son who built the Great Pyramid. His very name tells us something about how he was seen. Sneferu. The name can be understood to mean something like, he of beauty, or he has made me beautiful, or the one who makes things good and beautiful. It is a gentle name, a name of goodness and perfection, and it fits the memory the Egyptians would keep of him. For 1,000 years and more after his death, Sneferu was remembered not as a harsh or fearsome ruler, but as a beneficent king, a good king, a kind king, a bringer of prosperity and order. A later Egyptian text looking back across the centuries describes how, when the old king Huni died, Sneferu was raised up as a beneficent king in the whole land. That single word, beneficent, echoes down through the ages. Of all the things a king might be remembered for, Sneferu was remembered for his goodness. Hold that in your mind as we go, for it is one of the keys to the man, not a tyrant driving slaves with the whip, as the old myths would have it, but a ruler remembered for 1,000 years as good. And what do we know of the shape of his reign? He ruled for a long time. How long exactly we cannot say, and the ancient sources disagree. One old king list gives him around 24 years, but most scholars believe this is an underestimate given the sheer quantity of building he accomplished, and many think he reigned for at least 30 years, perhaps more. Some have suggested even longer. A reign of 30 years or more, in an age when many people did not live past 40, is a long and stable rule, long enough to plan and carry out not one but several colossal building projects, long enough to send armies to the frontiers and ships to distant coasts, long enough to reshape the administration of the whole kingdom, and long enough to be remembered ever after as a golden age. Whatever the exact number of years, this much is clear: Sneferu ruled long, and he ruled well, and he used his long reign to build on a scale that had never been seen before, and would rarely be matched again. For that is the heart of his story, the thing above all others for which he is remembered, the building. Sneferu was the greatest pyramid builder in the history of the world, not in the fame of any single monument. For his son's great pyramid would eclipse them all in renown, but in sheer quantity, in the total mass of stone raised, in the number of great pyramids built in a single reign. He built the pyramid at Midam, which began as a stepped pyramid and was then transformed in a bold and fateful experiment into a true smooth-sided pyramid, an experiment that ended, it seems, in partial collapse. He built the bent pyramid at Dashur, the strange and beautiful monument that changes its angle halfway up, as if the builders lost their nerve or learned a hard lesson while the stone was still rising. And he built the red pyramid, also at Dashur, the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed, rising clean and perfect from the desert. The direct ancestor of the Great Pyramid of Giza, 3 great mountains of stone in a single reign. Together, they contain more stone than the Great Pyramid itself. No king before or after moved so much. Let us dwell a little longer on the kingdom Sneferu inherited, for its wealth and its order are the foundation of everything he would build. Egypt in this age was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily rich, and its riches came from the river. Each year the flood watered the fields, and the fields produced grain in abundance, far more than the people needed to eat. That surplus of grain was the true treasure of Egypt. It could be stored and counted and used to feed workers who were not growing food, workers who could instead quarry stone, or haul it, or build. A civilization that can feed a large number of non-farming workers is a civilization that can build great things, and Egypt, thanks to the river, could feed a great many. This is the quiet secret behind the pyramids. Not magic, not slavery driven by whips, but grain, gathered and stored and organized by a sophisticated state, and used to sustain the thousands of hands that raised the stone. And the state was sophisticated indeed. Egypt was governed by a vast and intricate administration, a machinery of scribes and officials and overseers that reached from the king in his palace down to the smallest village. Scribes recorded the harvest, measured the fields, counted the cattle, tracked the goods flowing in from the provinces and the frontiers. Officials organized the labor of the people, gathered the workers for the great projects, saw that they were fed and housed and directed. Priests served in the temples, and performed the rituals on which, the Egyptians believed, the order of the world depended. All of it answered, in the end, to the king who stood at the center as the guardian of order, the living link between his people and the powers they revered. It was one of the most organized societies on the earth in its age, and it was this organization, as much as any single monument, that made the age of pyramids possible. Picture the capital city, Memphis, at the height of the morning. The white walls of the royal palace rising above the mud brick houses, the dust of the streets, the smell of bread baking and beer brewing in the great kitchens, the scribes sitting cross-legged with their reed pens and their sheets of papyrus. The river crowded with boats bringing stone and grain and timber and every kind of good toward the heart of the kingdom. The workshops of the craftsmen, where the finest work in stone and wood and metal and faience was made. And beyond the city, across the river, up on the desert plateau, the tombs of the dead and the great stepped pyramids of the previous kings, rising pale against the sky. This was the world Sneferu knew, the world he would rule and the world he would transform. It was already magnificent. He would make it more magnificent still. Now let us think about what it meant in this world to be the king. The Egyptians did not see their king as merely a powerful man. They saw him as a sacred figure, set apart from ordinary humanity, standing at the meeting point between the human world and the world of the unseen powers they revered. The king was the guardian of order, the one who held the balance of the world, the living link between his people and the forces that govern the cosmos. He was associated above all with the figure they called Horus, the falcon, the protector of kingship. And in Sneferu's reign, something new was stirring in the way the king's sacredness was understood. A growing emphasis on the figure the Egyptians associated with the sun, the one they called Ra. This shift from the older beliefs toward a stronger focus on the sun would leave its mark on the very shape of the pyramid Sneferu built, as we will see. For the smooth-sided true pyramid, the form Sneferu would perfect may itself have been a solar symbol, an image of the sun's rays slanting down to earth, or of the mound on which the sun was believed to have first risen. To build in this new form was, perhaps, to build a monument to the sun, and to the king's place within its eternal order. We should also place Sneferu carefully in the line of kings, for his position at the head of a new dynasty is part of his story. The scholars who study these things divide the long history of Egypt into dynasties, families, or lines of kings, and Sneferu is counted as the founder of the fourth dynasty, one of the greatest lines in all of Egyptian history. Before him came the third dynasty, the dynasty of Djoser and the first stepped pyramids. After him would come his son and his son's son, and the great pyramids of Giza Sneferu stands. Then at a hinge in history, at the very start of the dynasty that would raise the most famous monuments the world has ever seen. He is the founder, the beginning, the father of it all. And whether or not he was the son of the king before him, it was Sneferu who truly opened the Golden Age. Sneferu, whose reign the later Egyptians would look back on as the dawn of greatness. Let us return, too, to the woman who stood beside him, for Queen Hetepheres is one of the most important figures of the age, and her story is bound up with his. Hetepheres, believed to be the daughter of the king before him, was Sneferu's principal wife, his great royal queen, and the mother of his heir. Through her, the two royal lines were joined, and the succession secured. And she would become, in her own right, one of the most famous queens of the Old Kingdom, though for a strange reason that would only emerge thousands of years later, when her hidden burial was discovered near the Great Pyramid, filled with exquisite furniture of gold and precious materials. We will come to that discovery later in our night, for it is one of the most remarkable stories in all of Egyptology. For now, simply hold her in your mind, Hetepheres, the queen at Sneferu's side, mother of the king who would build the Great Pyramid, the woman through whom the greatest dynasty of the Old Kingdom took its shape. And around the king and queen gathered a great royal family for Sneferu, had many children, and his children would fill the highest offices of the kingdom. His sons served as viziers, the chief ministers of the state, the most powerful men in Egypt after the king himself. His daughters married within the royal house, binding the family together and keeping power concentrated within it. One son above all would carry the story forward. The prince who would succeed him and build the Great Pyramid, the son whose name would eclipse his father's for 4,500 years. But there were many others, princes and princesses, whose names survive on the walls of their tombs clustered around their father's pyramids. A whole royal generation raised in the shadow of the great building projects. To be born a child of Sneferu was to be born into the ruling family of the age, at the very summit of the Egyptian world. There is one more thing to carry with us as we move deeper into the story, and it is the memory the Egyptians kept of this reign. Long after Sneferu was gone, in the age we call the Middle Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after his death, Egyptian writers still looked back on his reign as a golden time. They told tales set in his court. They named places after him. They remembered him as the beneficent king, the good ruler, the maker of beautiful things. Few kings are remembered so warmly and for so long. Most are forgotten within a few generations, or remembered only as names on a list. Sneferu became something more, a legend of good kingship, a symbol of a golden age, a name that carried warmth across 1,000 years. That memory is itself part of his story, and we will return to it at the end of our night. For now, let it stand as a promise of what is to come, that the man whose life we are about to follow was, in the end, one of the best loved kings in the whole long history of Egypt. Let us also fix in our minds the places where this story unfolds. For the geography of Sneferu's reign is the geography of the pyramid fields, the great necropolis that stretches along the western desert near the ancient capital. To the north lay Saqqara, where Djoser's step pyramid already stood, the first mountain of stone. Somewhat to the south lay Midam, a site on the edge of the fertile land where Sneferu's first great pyramid would rise. The one that began as a stepped pyramid and was transformed into a true one. The one that appears, in the end, to have partly collapsed. And between them lay Dashur, the site that Sneferu would make his own, where he built not one but two colossal pyramids. First the bent pyramid, with its strange changing angle, and then the red pyramid, the first true smooth pyramid ever completed. These three sites, Midam and Dashur above all, are the stage on which the drama of Sneferu's building unfolds. Across them, in stone, is written the story of a man learning to build a mountain. When we walk through his reign, we will walk through these places, from the collapsed tower at Midam to the bent monument at Dashur to the perfect red pyramid. Beside it, reading in each the next chapter of the story. And it is worth pausing, before we go on the sheer strangeness and wonder of what Sneferu attempted. No one had ever built a true, smooth-sided pyramid before. The stepped pyramids of the previous dynasty were remarkable, but they were, in a sense, a natural extension of stacking, of piling tier upon tier, each smaller than the last. To build a true pyramid, with smooth, flat faces rising at a constant angle to a single point high in the sky, was a far harder problem. It required the builders to understand angles and stability, and the distribution of enormous weight, in ways no one had fully worked out. It required them to solve problems that had never been solved. And Sneferu, across his long reign, solved them, one by one, through the patient method of trying, failing, and correcting. That is the deep story of his reign, and it is a story we can still read today in the three great monuments he left behind. Let us begin, slowly, to read it now. And so we have the shape of the world and the shape of the man. A wealthy, ancient kingdom at the dawn of its greatest age that had learned to build stepped pyramids, but not yet true ones. A king of uncertain birth who secured his throne by marrying the royal heiress, and who would be remembered for 1,000 years as good and beneficent. A long and stable reign turned toward building on a scale never seen before. And three great pyramids in the desert, each one a chapter in the story of a man learning, through failure and correction, to build a perfect mountain, Let us follow that story now from the beginning, into the core of Sneferu's life and reign, and the mountains he raised toward the sky. So here we are at the heart of the story of Sneferu, the man who built mountains. This is the longest part of our night, and we will move through it slowly, in several flowing parts, following the great arc of his building from the first experiment to the final triumph. For the reign of Sneferu is, above all, the story of a man learning to build a true pyramid, and that learning is written, chapter by chapter, in 3 great monuments in the desert. We will walk through them in turn: the pyramid at Midam, which reached for the true form and appears to have fallen; the bent pyramid at Dashur, which changed its angle in midair; and the red pyramid, which finally rose smooth and perfect against the sky. Each is a stage in a single journey. Together, they tell one of the greatest stories of human ingenuity in all of ancient history. Let us follow it, gently, from the beginning. Let us begin at Midam, on the edge of the fertile land, south of the ancient capital, where Sneferu's first great pyramid still stands today, though not in the shape its builders intended. If you go to Midam now, you will see one of the strangest sights in all of Egypt. A tall, steep, sided tower of pale stone, rising in 3 great stages from an enormous mound of rubble and sand that surrounds its base. It does not look like a pyramid. It looks like a tower or a fortress, or the ruin of some great keep standing alone in the desert. And that strange shape is itself a clue to what happened here. 4,500 years ago, in the earliest days of Sneferu's building, for the pyramid at Midam was not always meant to be a true pyramid. It began like the monuments of the previous dynasty, as a stepped pyramid, built in great receding tiers, one stacked upon the next, rising toward the sky in a staircase of stone. Some scholars believe it may even have been begun by the king before Sneferu, and completed by Sneferu, though others credit the whole of it to Sneferu himself. Either way, in its first form it was a step pyramid, in the old tradition of Djoser, but then something changed. At some point, Sneferu's builders decided to transform this stepped pyramid into a true one, to fill in the steps with an outer packing of stone, and to case the whole in smooth limestone so that it would rise in clean, flat faces to a single point. In the new form, the true pyramid form, that no one had yet completed. It was a bold decision, a reaching toward something new, and it is one of the earliest attempts we know of to build a true smooth-sided pyramid, and it appears to have failed. For at some point, either during construction or not long after, the outer layers of the Midam pyramid seem to have collapsed, sliding down in a great avalanche of stone, leaving the inner stepped core standing bare, surrounded by the vast mound of rubble we see today. That mound is, in the view of many scholars, the fallen outer casing of the pyramid, the smooth, true pyramid shell that slid away and left the old step tower exposed. Now, we must be careful and honest here, for scholars debate exactly when and why this collapse happened. Some believe it fell during construction, a catastrophe that taught Sneferu's builders a hard and lasting lesson. Others believe it happened much later, long after Sneferu, through slow decay and the removal of stone by later generations. The evidence is not entirely clear, and honest Egyptologists disagree. But the most striking interpretation, and one held by serious scholars, is that Midam was an experiment that went wrong, a first attempt at the true pyramid that reached too far, too fast, and came tumbling down. And it gets stranger when you think about what such a failure would have meant. Imagine it. The king's own pyramid, his eternal house, the monument meant to carry him into the afterlife, collapsing in a roar of falling stone, either as it was built or soon after. In a civilization that saw the king's tomb as sacred, as essential to the order of the world, such a collapse would have been more than an engineering setback. It would have been a disaster, a shock, perhaps even a thing of shame. And yet Sneferu did not stop. He did not abandon the dream of the true pyramid. Instead, he moved north, to Dashur. And he tried again. That is the mark of the man that, faced with a collapse that might have broken another king's nerve, he learned, and moved on and built again more carefully this time. The failure at Midim, if that is what it was not the end of Sneferu's building. It was the beginning of his mastery. Let us step inside the Midim pyramid for a moment, for its interior tells us about the age as much as its outside does. From the north face, a passage descends into the heart of the monument, sloping down through the masonry and into the rock beneath, to a burial chamber built within the body of the pyramid. Inside that chamber, the builders used the corbelling technique, laying each course of stone slightly inward over the one below, so that the walls rise and lean together toward a high ceiling, a method that helped carry the enormous weight of the stone above. It is an early example of a technique that Sneferu's builders would refine in his later pyramids, and that would reach its full glory in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Around the Great Pyramid at Midim lay a whole cemetery of mastabas, the tombs of the royal family and the high officials of the court, some of them containing among the most beautiful painted reliefs and statues to survive from the whole Old Kingdom, including famous seated statues of a prince and his wife, their eyes inlaid with rock crystal so lifelike that, when they were discovered, the workmen are said to have fled in fright. So Midim was not only a pyramid, it was a royal necropolis, a city of the dead, gathered around the king's first great mountain of stone. And the strangeness of the Midim pyramid drew visitors even in ancient times. Long after Sneferu, in the age of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years later, Egyptian visitors came to Midim and left inscriptions on its walls, admiring the monument and marveling at its maker. Even then, even to the ancient Egyptians themselves, the pyramid at Midim was an object of wonder and mystery, an ancient thing from a distant golden age. That it still stood, tower-like and strange above its mound of rubble, only deepened the sense that here was something from the very dawn of their world, from the reign of the great and beneficent king who first learned to build in the true form. The question of exactly how and when the Midim pyramid collapsed has fascinated scholars for a long time, and it is worth dwelling on, for it opens a window onto how these monuments were built and how they could fail. One influential idea, put forward in the 20th century by the scientist Kurt Mendelsohn, held that the Midim pyramid collapsed suddenly and catastrophically while it was still being built, perhaps even while work was going on at the bent pyramid at the same time. In this dramatic view, a heavy rain, or a structural weakness, or the steep angle and the smooth foundation on which the outer casing rested, caused the outer layers to shear away all at once, sliding down in a great avalanche of stone that buried the base and left the stepped core standing bare. Mendelsohn even suggested that the shock of this collapse was what led Sneferu's builders to change the angle of the bent pyramid partway up to avoid the same disaster. It is a compelling story, and it ties the three pyramids together into a single dramatic narrative of failure and correction. But we must be honest that not all scholars accept this. Others argue that the Midim pyramid did not collapse during construction at all, but decayed slowly over thousands of years, its casing loosened and its stone quarried away by later generations who used the ancient monument as a source of building material until the outer layers slid and slumped into the mound we see today. In this quieter view, the strange shape of Midim is the work of time and human scavenging, not a sudden ancient catastrophe. The truth may lie somewhere between, and the debate continues. But whichever is right, the Midim pyramid stands as a powerful reminder that these monuments were experiments, pushed to the very edge of what the builders could achieve, and that the road to the perfect pyramid ran through failure and uncertainty. That is the honest state of our knowledge. We know the pyramid stands in a strange and ruined form, and we know that Sneferu went on to build more safely afterward. But exactly what happened at Midim, and when, remains open. So let us follow him north, to Dashur, to the second great chapter of the story, the bent pyramid. Here at Dashur, Sneferu began a new pyramid, and this time he meant it to be a true pyramid from the start, smooth-sided, rising at a steep angle to a point. The builders laid out the base and began to raise the great mass of stone, and for the lower part of the pyramid, They built at a bold, steep angle around 54 degrees, a sharp and dramatic slope. And then, partway up, something happened. The angle changes. Suddenly, at about half the height, the slope of the pyramid becomes much shallower, dropping to around 43 degrees, so that the upper part of the pyramid rises far more gently than the lower part. The result is a monument unlike any other in the world. A pyramid that is steep at the bottom and shallow at the top, bent in the middle, as if it changed its mind halfway to the sky. This is the bent pyramid, and it is one of the most fascinating and mysterious monuments Sneferu ever raised. Why does it bend? Here we come to one of the great questions of Sneferu's reign, and again, we must be honest that scholars debate it. The most widely held view is that the change of angle was a response to trouble, a correction made while the pyramid was rising. As the great mass of stone climbed higher at its steep original angle, the builders may have begun to see signs of instability, cracks, and stresses within the structure, perhaps made worse by the memory of what had happened at Midam. Fearing that this pyramid too might collapse, they changed the angle partway up, reducing the slope, lightening the upper structure, spreading the weight more safely, in order to finish the monument without disaster. In this view, the bend is a scar, a visible record of a mid-course correction, a moment when Sneferu's builders, halfway to the sky, chose safety over ambition, and changed their design to save the pyramid. Others have suggested different reasons, that the builders wished to finish more quickly, or that the bend had some symbolic meaning, but the stability explanation is the most widely accepted, and it fits the larger story of Sneferu's reign so well. A king and his builders, learning from failure, correcting as they go, feeling their way toward the true pyramid through trial and error written in solid stone. And there is more to the bent pyramid that makes it precious. Of all the pyramids of Egypt, it is the one that best keeps its original outer casing, the smooth white limestone that once covered them all. On most of the great pyramids, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, that outer casing was stripped away over the centuries, carried off to build other things, leaving the rough stone core exposed. But on the bent pyramid, much of the beautiful smooth casing still clings to the stone, so that even today it gleams pale in the desert sun, giving us a glimpse of how all the pyramids once looked, not rough and brown, as we usually see them, but smooth and white and shining, like mountains of light. To stand before the bent pyramid is to see, more nearly than anywhere else, what Sneferu's builders actually made, a smooth, gleaming, casing-clad monument, bent though it is, still wearing the white skin that time stripped from its brothers. And the bent pyramid holds other wonders besides its casing and its strange shape. Alone among the pyramids of Egypt, it has two separate entrances, one on the north face and one on the west, leading to two separate systems of passages and chambers within, an arrangement found in no other pyramid. Why the builders made two entrances, no one can fully explain. It is one of the small mysteries that cling to this most unusual of monuments. Inside, the passages lead to high corbelled chambers with soaring ceilings, built with the same inward, leaning technique we saw at Midam, refined and made grander. Beside the Great Pyramid stands a smaller subsidiary pyramid, a cult pyramid, thought to be connected with the spirit of the king, and the whole monument had, in its own age, a formal name as all the pyramids did. For the Egyptians did not call them pyramids, but gave each a name of its own. The bent pyramid's name is generally understood to mean something like the Southern Shining Pyramid, or Sneferu shines in the south, a name that speaks of light and radiance, of a monument gleaming in its white casing under the southern sun. To the Egyptians, these were not tombs of death and darkness, but shining houses of eternity, blazing with light. So the bent pyramid was finished, saved by the change of angle, standing complete on the desert at Dashur. But its bent shape was not the perfect form Sneferu was reaching for. It was a compromise, a monument rescued by a mid-course correction, not the clean, true pyramid of the dream. And so, remarkably, Sneferu did not stop even here. Having built the collapsed pyramid at Midam and the bent pyramid at Dashur, he began yet another, a third Great Pyramid, his largest yet right beside the bent pyramid at Dashur. And this time, at last, he got it right. This time, he built the Red Pyramid. The Red Pyramid is the triumph of Sneferu's reign, the culmination of a lifetime of learning. The first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed in the history of the world, learning from the collapse at Midim and the near failure of the bent pyramid. Sneferu's builders raised the Red Pyramid at a gentle, safe angle from the start, the same shallower angle, around 43 degrees, that had saved the upper part of the bent pyramid. Rising at that safe slope, the Red Pyramid climbed steadily and securely to its point, a great smooth mountain of stone, stable and complete, the first perfect true pyramid on the earth. It takes its name from the reddish hue of the limestone of its core, which glows warm in the light of the setting sun. And it is enormous. One of the largest pyramids in all of Egypt, surpassed in size only by the Great Pyramid of Giza, and by some measures the pyramid of Sneferu's grandson. To build it, after the collapse and the bend, was to prove that the lesson had finally been learned, that the problem of the true pyramid had finally been solved. Step inside the Red Pyramid, and you enter one of the most beautiful spaces of the ancient world. From the entrance high on the north face, a long passage descends to a series of chambers deep within the monument, and 2 of these chambers have magnificent corbelled ceilings, rising in 11 great inward, stepping courses of stone to a height that soars far above your head, so that the rooms feel like tall, narrow cathedrals of pale limestone, hidden in the heart of the mountain. These corbelled ceilings are among the finest of their kind, the direct ancestors of the grand gallery inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, which Sneferu's son would build a short time later. To stand in these chambers is to stand inside the workshop of an idea, to see the technique that would reach its ultimate expression in the most famous building on earth. Already here, already magnificent, in the Pyramid of the Father, and there is a small human detail hidden in the Red Pyramid that reaches across the centuries and touches us directly. On some of the stones of the pyramid, the workers left markings, including dates from Sneferu's reign, notes scrawled in red by the work gangs as they built. One of these gives a date corresponding to the 24th count, a way the Egyptians reckoned the years of a reign, which tells us that the Red Pyramid was being built well into Sneferu's long rule. These humble workmen's marks, red paint on rough stone, are among the ways we know how long Sneferu reigned, and when his pyramids rose, they are the fingerprints of the builders left on the stone 4,500 years ago, still legible today. Through them, the anonymous workers who raised the mountain reach out and speak to us, telling us in their own hand when they did the work. And here is a quiet mystery that hangs over the Red Pyramid, and indeed over all of Sneferu's monuments. For all 3 of his great pyramids stand in the desert, and yet the body of Sneferu himself has never been found. No mummy certainly identified as the king, no intact royal burial has been recovered from any of them. Some fragments of human remains were found within the Red Pyramid, and some have wondered whether they might belong to the king, but nothing is certain, and the matter is debated. So we are left with a strange fact. The greatest builder of tombs in the history of Egypt, the man who raised 3 mountains of stone to house his eternity, lies nowhere that we can find. His body, like the bodies of so many of the pyramid kings, vanished into the long ages, lost to robbers and to time. 3 pyramids and no king within them. It is one of the enduring riddles of his reign, and one we will return to before the night is done. Stand back now and see the whole arc of it. For this is the core of Sneferu's greatness. 3 great pyramids in a single reign. First at Midim, the bold experiment that reached for the true form and appears to have fallen, teaching a hard lesson. Then at Dashur, the bent pyramid, which met trouble halfway to the sky and was saved by a change of angle, a monument of correction. And finally, beside it, the Red Pyramid, which took the lesson of the bend and built safely from the start, rising smooth and perfect and complete, the first true pyramid in the world. Together, These three monuments contain more stone than the Great Pyramid of Giza itself. In sheer mass, in total volume of stone quarried and moved and raised, Sneferu was the greatest builder in the history of Egypt, and perhaps in the history of the world. And more than that, he was the man who solved the problem, who turned the stepped pyramids of the past into the true pyramids of the future, who opened the door through which his son would walk to build the Great Pyramid. And it gets stranger and more moving still when you realize that we can watch him do it, that the three pyramids are like three photographs of a mind at work, a record in stone of a human being learning, failing, correcting, and finally succeeding at one of the hardest things anyone had ever tried to do. And there is more to this story than the shapes of the pyramids, for inside them and around them, Sneferu's builders were working out the whole architecture of the royal tomb. Inside the bent pyramid and the red pyramid, they built high corbelled chambers, rooms with soaring ceilings made by laying each course of stone slightly inward over the one below, until the walls met far overhead, a technique that would be perfected in the Great Pyramid's famous Grand Gallery. Around the pyramids, they laid out the full complex of a royal funerary monument. The pyramid itself, a temple beside it where the rituals for the dead king would be performed, a causeway leading down toward the valley, and a smaller subsidiary pyramid, a cult pyramid thought to be connected to the king's spirit. His Ka, all of this, the whole standard form of the pyramid complex that would be used for centuries, was being worked out and established in Sneferu's reign. He did not only invent the true pyramid, he helped invent the whole architecture of royal eternity that would surround it. Consider, too, what the change in the very shape of the pyramid may have meant, for the shift from the stepped pyramid to the smooth true pyramid was not only an engineering achievement, but perhaps a change in belief. The stepped pyramids of the previous dynasty have been understood by some as great staircases, ladders of stone by which the dead king might climb toward the sky, toward the stars that never set in the northern heaven. But the smooth, true pyramid that Sneferu perfected may carry a different meaning, tied to the growing importance of the figure the Egyptians associated with the sun. Some scholars believe the smooth pyramid was meant to evoke the rays of the sun slanting down to earth, or the sacred mound on which, in Egyptian belief, the sun first rose at the beginning of the world. In this reading, Sneferu's new form was a solar monument, a great image in stone of the sun's power, and the king's place within it, rising smooth and radiant, and clad in gleaming white limestone, so that it shone like the sun itself. If so, then Sneferu did not only change how pyramids were built, he may have changed what they meant, turning the king's tomb from a staircase to the stars into a ray of the sun made solid. We cannot be certain, for the builders left no explanation, and this remains a matter of interpretation. But it fits the age, an age in which the sun was rising to the center of Egyptian belief, and it deepens the wonder of what Sneferu made. There is a beauty, too, in imagining these monuments as they first appeared, before time stripped them bare. We are used to seeing the pyramids as rough, brown, stepped, looking mountains of exposed core stone, but that is not how they looked when they were new. When Sneferu's pyramids were finished, they were cased in smooth, fine white limestone, polished and gleaming, rising in perfect unbroken faces to their points. In the bright Egyptian sun, they would have blazed with reflected light, dazzling to look upon, visible for many miles across the valley, shining like mountains of white fire against the blue sky and the golden desert. The Egyptians named them for that radiance, shining pyramids, gleaming houses of eternity. To the people of the valley looking up from their fields, these were not tombs of death but blazing symbols of the king's eternal power. Catching the light of the sun the king was coming to embody, that is the sight Sneferu gave his people, white mountains of light, rising from the desert, the first true pyramids in the world. Let us pause and think about the sheer scale of what this required. For the numbers, even spelled slowly, are staggering. To build 3 great pyramids in a single reign, Sneferu's workers had to quarry, move, and set in place millions of tons of stone. The Red Pyramid alone contained something on the order of 1.5 million cubic meters of stone. The Bent Pyramid nearly as much, and Midam too, a vast mass. Together, Sneferu's monuments contain more stone than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Every block of that stone had to be cut from the quarries, often with tools of copper and stone. For this was before the age of iron. Every block had to be moved, dragged on sledges over prepared tracks, sometimes floated on barges along the river, or on canals dug to carry them. Every block had to be raised into place, up ramps of earth and brick, by the muscle of many workers pulling together. And all of those workers had to be fed and housed and organized day after day, year after year, across the decades of Sneferu's reign. Who were these workers? Here we must set aside the old myth, the image of vast armies of slaves driven by the whip under a cruel taskmaster. The evidence from the age of the pyramids tells a different and more human story. The great monuments were built largely by organized teams of Egyptian workers, gangs with names who seem to have served in rotation, brought in from the villages of the valley, fed and housed and provided for by the state, and who took, by the marks they left, a real pride in their work. Some were skilled craftsmen who worked year-round. Others were ordinary people who gave a period of labor to the king, perhaps in the season when the fields were flooded and farm work was impossible. They were organized into crews and gangs with names that sometimes survive, names that speak of devotion to the king. And they left those names daubed on the stones they set. This was not the work of the whip. It was the organized labor of a whole people, gathered and directed by a sophisticated state in the service of their sacred king, and they believed of the order of the world itself. And Sneferu's building may have gone beyond even the 3 great pyramids. Some scholars attribute to him, or to his reign, a series of small step pyramids built at sites up and down the Nile Valley, modest monuments that may have served as markers of royal presence or centers of the royal cult in the provinces. There is also a small pyramid at a place called Sela, near Midam, that appears to belong to Sneferu, so the true total of his building may be even greater than the 3 colossal monuments for which he is best known. Whatever the exact count, the conclusion is the same. No king in the history of Egypt built so much, moved so much stone, or left so vast a mark upon the land. He was, without rival, the greatest builder of the age, and perhaps of any age. There is one more question worth sitting with, here in the heart of the story, and it is a simple one. Why build 3? Why, having built the collapsed pyramid at Midam, and then the great bent pyramid, did Sneferu build a 3rd colossal pyramid? The red pyramid, right beside the 2nd. A king needs only 1 tomb. Why 3 or more? The likeliest answer is the one that runs through his whole reign, that the earlier attempts were, in his eyes, not good enough. Midam had failed. The bent pyramid was a compromise, saved by a change of angle, not the perfect true pyramid of the dream. And so Sneferu, unsatisfied, built again, and built the red pyramid to be right, to be perfect, to be the true smooth pyramid at last. In this reading, the 3 pyramids are the visible record of a perfectionist at work, a king who would not settle for a flawed monument, who kept building until he had it right. And when he finally had it right, in the red pyramid, he had not only built himself a perfect tomb, he had shown his son, and his son's builders, exactly how the true pyramid was done, and so had made the Great Pyramid of Giza possible. There is more to be said, too, about the great complexes that surrounded these pyramids. For Sneferu's builders were not only raising mountains of stone, but inventing the whole setting of royal eternity. A finished pyramid did not stand alone. Beside it rose a mortuary temple, a place where priests would perform the daily rituals for the dead king, bringing offerings and burning incense to sustain his spirit forever. From the temple, a long covered causeway ran down the slope toward the edge of the fertile land, and at its lower end stood a valley temple, a gateway between the world of the living and the sacred precinct of the pyramid, where the king's body and the funeral goods would arrive by water and begin their final journey up to the tomb. This whole arrangement, the pyramid, the mortuary temple, the causeway, and the valley temple, became the standard form of the royal funerary complex, used for centuries afterward, and much of it was worked out and established in Sneferu's reign. When his son came to build at Giza, he inherited not only the true pyramid form, but this entire architecture of eternity, developed and perfected under his father. And these temples have given us treasures of their own. In the valley temple of one of Sneferu's pyramids at Dashur, excavators found carved reliefs, and among them, one of the earliest known lists of the nomes, the administrative provinces into which Egypt was divided, the districts through which the kingdom was governed and its wealth gathered. These carved figures, personifications of the provinces bringing their offerings to the king, are among the oldest records we have of how Egypt was organized as a state. They remind us that Sneferu's reign was not only an age of building, but an age of administration, of a kingdom carefully divided and governed, its provinces bound to the king and pouring their wealth toward his great projects. The pyramids were the visible glory of that organized state, but the reliefs in the Valley Temple show us its quiet machinery, the provinces and the offerings and the ordered flow of wealth that made the mountains of stone possible. We should also place the Red Pyramid in the great line of Egyptian monuments, for its size tells us something about Sneferu's ambition. When it was finished, the Red Pyramid was one of the largest structures in the world, and it remains, today, one of the largest pyramids in all of Egypt. Only the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by Sneferu's son, and by some measures the second pyramid at Giza, built by his grandson, would surpass it. So when Sneferu finished the Red Pyramid, he had built, so far as we know, the largest true pyramid yet raised, the tallest and most massive smooth-sided monument in the world, a mountain of stone that would only be exceeded by his own descendants. From the collapse at Midim to the largest true pyramid in the world, in a single reign, that is the measure of the distance Sneferu traveled, the arc of his learning, the scale of his achievement. There is something worth pausing on before we gather the threads about what it means that we can watch Sneferu learn. Most of the great achievements of the ancient world come to us finished, perfect, complete, with the struggle behind them hidden. We see the Great Pyramid, flawless and vast, but we do not see the centuries of failure and experiment that made it possible. Sneferu's reign is different. In his 3 pyramids, the struggle is not hidden. It is written plainly in the stone for anyone to read. The collapse at Midim, the bend at Dashur, the perfect Red Pyramid. It is as if we have been handed the rough drafts of a masterpiece, the crossed outlines and the corrections, alongside the final clean copy. And there is something deeply moving in that, something human, for it reminds us that even the greatest achievements are built on failure, that mastery comes not in a single flash, but through patient trial and error, through the willingness to fail and learn and try again. Sneferu could have hidden his failures. Instead, he left them standing in the desert, and in doing so, he left us one of the most honest and human records of genius at work that has ever survived. 4,500 years later, we can still watch a mind learning to build a mountain, still read the rough drafts and the careful corrections written plainly there in the stone. One question naturally arises from all this building: which of his pyramids was Sneferu actually buried in? A king, after all, needs only one tomb, and yet Sneferu left 3 great pyramids behind. Most scholars believe that the Red Pyramid, his final and most perfect monument, was intended as his true burial place, the tomb in which he meant to rest for eternity. The bent pyramid, with its flawed and compromised shape, may have been abandoned as a burial site once its problems became clear, though it was finished and given its own complex. And Midim, whatever its fate, seems not to have received the king. So the Red Pyramid is the best candidate for his tomb, the smooth and perfect mountain that was to be his eternal house. And yet, as we have seen, no certain trace of his body has ever been found in the Red Pyramid or anywhere else. The king built himself the finest tomb in the world, and then somehow across the long ages vanished from it. That mystery hangs over all 3 of his mountains, and we will return to it before the night is through, for it is one of the strangest facts in the whole story of the man who built more tombs than any king in history, and yet lies in none of them that we can find. So let us gather ourselves here, for we have come a long way, through 3 great monuments and a lifetime of building. Here is where we are. Snefounder of the 4th dynasty set out to build a true pyramid, a thing no one had ever completed. At Maydam, his first great attempt reached for the true form and appears to have collapsed, teaching a hard lesson. At Dashur, the bent pyramid met trouble halfway up and was saved by a change of angle. And finally, beside it, the red pyramid rose smooth and perfect and complete, the first true pyramid in the world. In the process, Sneferu moved more stone than any pharaoh in history, and worked out the whole architecture of the royal tomb that his successors would use. This is the core of his greatness, not a single monument, but a lifetime of building, a journey from failure to mastery, written in 3 mountains of stone. But Sneferu was more than a builder, and his reign was more than its pyramids. Let us widen our view now and see the whole of his kingdom, the armies, and the ships, and the family, and the far frontiers, the wider story of the man who built mountains. For the pyramids, magnificent as they are, were only one part of his reign. And to know the man fully, we must follow his reach beyond the building sites, out into the wider world he ruled. So we have followed Sneferu through his 3 great mountains of stone, from the collapse at Maydam to the perfect red pyramid. But a king is more than his monuments, and Sneferu's reign was far more than a building program. To know the man fully, we must widen our view and see the whole of his kingdom, the armies he sent to the frontiers, the ships he sailed to distant coasts, the mines he opened in the desert mountains, the wealth that flowed into Egypt, the family that gathered around him, and the son who would surpass him. For the pyramids did not build themselves, and they were not built in isolation. They rose in the middle of a busy, reaching, prosperous kingdom, and the story of that kingdom is the wider story of Sneferu. Let us begin with the frontiers, and with the armies Sneferu sent beyond them, for he was not only a builder but a ruler who extended and defended the reach of Egypt. To the south, beyond the first great rapids of the Nile, lay the land the Egyptians called by various names, the region we know as Nubia, rich in gold and stone and the trade routes that reach deeper into the African continent. Ancient records preserve the memory of a great expedition that Sneferu led or sent southward into Nubia, an expedition that returned with an enormous quantity of captives and cattle. One old inscription records the taking of 7,000 captives, men and women, and 20,000 head of cattle, sheep, and goats. A vast haul brought back from the southern campaign. Whatever the exact numbers, and ancient figures are often rounded or exaggerated, the record shows a king reaching southward with real force, bringing back people and animals and wealth to feed the great projects at home. The captives would have added to the labor force, the cattle to the wealth of the kingdom. The southern frontier, under Sneferu, was a source of riches and of hands for the great work. To the west, too, Sneferu reached, in a campaign against the people the Egyptians called the Libyans, the inhabitants of the deserts west of the Nile. Here again the records speak of captives and cattle brought back, thousands of prisoners and thousands of animals, added to the wealth and the labor of Egypt. And to the northeast lay the rugged peninsula of Sinai, a land of harsh mountains but rich in things the Egyptians prized: copper, the metal from which they made their tools, and turquoise, the blue-green stone they treasured for its beauty and its meaning. Sneferu sent expeditions into Sinai to mine these riches, and he left his mark there carved into the rock. Reliefs in the Sinai show the king in the traditional pose of the triumphant ruler, proclaiming his power over that frontier and his mastery of its mines. So respected was his memory in Sinai that later generations of miners came to regard Sneferu almost as a patron of the place, a protective figure watching over the expeditions that followed his. From the deserts of Sinai came the copper for the tools and the turquoise for the treasures, gathered by the reach of the king. We should sit for a moment with what these campaigns meant, both for Egypt and for the peoples on its borders, and be honest about their nature. These were not wars of conquest to hold new territory, for the most part, but expeditions of raiding and resource gathering, reaching out from the settled valley to bring back what the kingdom wanted. People, animals, metal, stone. The captives taken in Nubia and Libya were brought into Egypt and set to work, adding to the labor available for the great projects and the estates. The cattle swelled the herds and the wealth of the kingdom. To the Egyptians, these campaigns were part of the king's sacred role as the protector of order, the one who held back the peoples of the wild lands beyond the borders and made the settled world safe and prosperous. The reliefs that show the king smiting his foes are less records of specific battles than statements of this role. The king as the guardian of the ordered world against the chaos outside. Sneferu, remembered as a gentle and beneficent king at home, was also at the frontiers, the vigorous protector and extender of his kingdom, reaching out to gather the wealth of the wider world. And the reach into Sinai was more than a matter of metal and stone. It was the beginning of a long tradition. Sneferu was among the great early pioneers of Egyptian mining in the Sinai, and the expeditions he sent there set a pattern that would be followed for centuries. Later kings sent their own expeditions to the same valleys, and carved their own images beside his on the same rocks, and the miners who came long after held Sneferu in a special regard, almost as a founding patron of the place. So the reliefs of Sneferu in the Sinai are not only records of his own reach, but the opening of a chapter that would run through the whole of Egyptian history, the long story of Egyptian mining in that harsh and rich frontier. Sneferu opened the way, and others followed for ages after. And Sneferu reached out across the sea as well, for one of the most remarkable records of his reign concerns not war but trade, and not the desert but the distant coast. Egypt was a land almost without large trees, without the tall straight timber needed for the grandest building and the finest boats. That timber, above all the great cedar, grew far to the northeast, in the lands along the eastern coast of the Great Sea, in the region we associate with Lebanon, and Sneferu sent ships to fetch it. Ancient annals record a fleet of ships bringing cedar wood to Egypt in his reign, a great importation of timber from the distant coast. Some of that cedar was used in his building projects, and some in the making of ships and doors and fine woodwork. This record is precious, for it shows Egypt reaching across the sea, trading and sailing to distant shores, gathering the materials it lacked from far away. The kingdom of Sneferu was not a closed and isolated valley. It was a reaching, trading, seafaring power, drawing in the riches of a wide world. There is even a named ship from his reign, one of the earliest named vessels in all of history. Among the records of Sneferu's reign is a ship called, in translation, something like Praise of the Two Lands, a great vessel of his fleet, remembered by name across 4,500 years. To have the name of a specific ship survive from so deep in the past is a rare and wonderful thing, and it gives us a vivid glimpse of the maritime life of the kingdom, the great boats on the river and the sea, each with its own name, carrying the wealth and the timber and the stone of Egypt. Praise of the Two Lands, a ship that sailed in the reign of Sneferu, its name still spoken today. How do we know these things, these campaigns and cargoes and ships from so deep in the past? Much of it comes from one of the most precious documents to survive from the Old Kingdom, a carved slab of dark stone that scholars call the Palermo stone, after the city where the largest fragment is kept. The Palermo stone is a fragment of the royal annals of early Egypt, a year-by-year record of the reigns of the early kings, listing the notable events of each year, the height of the Nile flood, the festivals held, the temples built, the campaigns fought, the goods brought in. And among its entries are records from the reign of Sneferu. It is here that we read of the fleet bringing cedar, of the campaigns into Nubia and against the Libyans, of the making of great statues and doors, of the counting of the cattle by which the years were reckoned. These entries, carved into hard stone, are among the oldest historical records in the world, a genuine chronicle of a real reign 4,500 years ago. Through them, the reign of Sneferu is not a blank or a legend, but a documented sequence of years and deeds, a king going about the business of ruling, campaigning, trading, and building recorded in the annals of his own age. The Palermo stone also helps us with the great question of how long Sneferu reigned, for it records the counts of the cattle, a periodic reckoning by which the Egyptians measured the years. By tracing these counts, and combining them with the dated workman's marks in the Red Pyramid, scholars have built up a picture of a long reign, considerably longer than the 24 years that one later king list assigns him. Most now believe he ruled for at least around 30 years, long enough to carry out the vast program of building and campaigning that fills his record. The exact figure is debated, and honest scholars disagree, but the weight of the evidence points to a long and full reign, decades of rule turned toward building and gathering and organizing. A short reign could not have raised 3 great pyramids and more. Only a long one could, and the record suggests that a long one is what Sneferu had. All of this, reaching to the south and the west and the northeast and across the sea, served a purpose beyond glory. It fed the great machine of the kingdom, and above all, it fed the building. The captives added to the labor force. The cattle and the grain fed the workers. The copper made the tools that cut the stone. The turquoise and the gold adorned the king and the temples. The cedar built the ships and strengthened the works. Sneferu's foreign reach and his building program were 2 halves of a single whole, a kingdom organized at every level to gather resources and labor and to pour them into the raising of mountains of stone. The armies and the ships and the mines were, in a sense, all in the service of the pyramids and of the prosperity that made them possible. And Sneferu did more than gather wealth. He organized the kingdom that gathered it. His reign saw the development of the highly centralized administration that marked the peak of the Old Kingdom, the intricate machinery of government through which the king ruled the whole length of the land. The provinces were organized and their wealth channeled toward the center. The offices of state grew in importance, and above all the office of vizier, the chief minister of the kingdom, the most powerful man after the king. And here we see how Sneferu bound his family to the running of the state, for the great offices, including the vizierate, were held by princes, by members of the royal family, men very close to the throne. The kingdom was governed, in large part by the king's own kin, a tight circle of royal power at the summit of the state. This concentration of power in the royal family was one of the marks of the age, and it reached a kind of height under Sneferu and his immediate successors. So let us turn now to that family, for it is one of the most important in all of Egyptian history, the family that would build Giza. At its center stood Sneferu and his great queen Hetepheres. And their son, the heir, was the prince who would become the next king, the builder of the Great Pyramid, the most famous monument on earth. He grew up in the shadow of his father's building, watching the pyramids rise, learning, we may imagine, the techniques and the organization and the ambition that he would one day turn to his own colossal monument at Giza. When he came to the throne, he inherited everything his father had built and learned. The true pyramid form, perfected in the Red Pyramid. The whole architecture of the funerary complex, the organized workforce, and the administrative machine, the reach across the frontiers, and the sea. He inherited, in short, a kingdom and a technology ready to build the greatest pyramid of all. And he did. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing, was the direct fruit of Sneferu's reign, built by his son on the foundation his father had laid. And the family reached beyond the air. Sneferu had many children, sons and daughters, who filled the high offices of the kingdom and married within the royal house. His sons served as viziers and officials. His daughters married princes and kept the royal blood concentrated within the family. Some of his descendants would themselves become kings, or the parents of kings, so that the whole 4th dynasty, the dynasty of Giza, flowed from Sneferu's line. The tombs of these royal children cluster around their father's pyramids and around the pyramids of Giza, a whole generation of princes and princesses whose names and titles survive on the walls of their mastabas. To trace Sneferu's family is to trace the ruling house of the greatest age of the Old Kingdom, the family that raised the pyramids of Giza and governed Egypt at the very peak of its early power. There is one member of the family whose story deserves special mention, for it would become, thousands of years later, one of the most famous discoveries in all of Egyptology. Queen Hatepers, Sneferu's wife, the mother of the king who built the Great Pyramid. Her tomb, or a hidden reburial of her funeral goods, was found near the Great Pyramid at Giza in the 20th century. A sealed shaft filled with exquisite furniture of gold and precious materials. A bed, a carrying chair, boxes, jewelry, all of the finest workmanship, hidden away and preserved for 4,500 years. We will come to that discovery in more detail later, for it is one of the great stories of ancient Egypt. For now, it is enough to say that through it, Queen Hatepers, the wife of Sneferu, became one of the best-known queens of the Old Kingdom. Her name and her treasures famous around the world. The family of Sneferu did not vanish into the silence of the past. Through such discoveries, and through the great monuments they built, they remain among the best-remembered people of the ancient world. Let us name some of these family members, for they were among the most powerful people of the age. The heir Sneferu's son and successor would take the throne as the next king and build the Great Pyramid. His name would become one of the most famous in all of history, though he himself remains, in many ways, a shadowy figure known above all for his single colossal monument. Around him were brothers and half-brothers who served the crown. One prince of the family, a man named Ankhaf, would become a vizier and hold enormous power, and a remarkable lifelike bust of him survives, one of the masterpieces of Old Kingdom portraiture, showing a real human face from the ruling family of the age. Other sons and grandsons held the vizierate and the great offices, so that the government of Egypt was, in effect, a family business run by the descendants of Sneferu. His daughters married within the house, some of them marrying their own brothers or half-brothers in the royal fashion, to keep the sacred bloodline concentrated and the succession secure. From this tight and powerful family would come not only the builder of the Great Pyramid, but the builders of the other pyramids of Giza, generation upon generation of the same royal line, and the family was touched, as all families are, by trouble and by loss, though the details are dim across the centuries. There are hints of tension over the succession, of rival branches of the family, of princes who died before their time. One of Sneferu's sons appears to have been buried at Midam, and some have wondered whether the death of a favored son may even have prompted the king to shift his building northward to Dashur, though this is speculation. What we can say is that the royal family of Sneferu, for all its power and wealth, lived the ordinary human dramas of any family, magnified by the stakes of a throne, the raising of children, the arranging of marriages, the deaths and the successions, the quiet rivalries and the bonds of blood. Behind the grand monuments and the great offices were real people, parents and children and siblings, living their lives at the summit of the Egyptian world. There is a deeper current running through Sneferu's reign that we should not miss, and it concerns the way the king himself was understood. In the older tradition, the living king was seen as the earthly presence of the figure. The Egyptians called Horus, the falcon, becoming fully divine in their belief only in death. But in Sneferu's age, a new emphasis was rising, an emphasis on the figure the Egyptians associated with the sun, the one they called Ra. Some scholars see in Sneferu's reign, and in the reigns around it, the beginnings of a shift toward the sun as the central figure of royal belief, a shift that would grow in the generations that followed until the kings took names and titles proclaiming their bond with the sun. We have already seen how this may be written into the very shape of his pyramids, the smooth, true pyramid as a possible symbol of the sun's rays or the primeval mound. So Sneferu's reign may mark not only a turning point in building but a turning point in belief, a moment when the sun began its long rise to the center of the Egyptian idea of kingship and the cosmos. The mountains of stone he raised may be, in part, monuments to that rising sun and to the king's new place within its eternal order. It is worth dwelling, too, on how Sneferu lived on in the imagination of later Egyptians. for the tales they told about him reveal the warmth of his memory. In a famous collection of stories written down long after his death, in the age we call the Middle Kingdom, Sneferu appears as a character in his own right, a king at leisure in his palace, and the story that survives is charming and strangely intimate. In it, the king is bored and restless, and one of his wise men suggests that he take a boat out on the palace lake, rowed by beautiful young women of the court, to lift his spirits. The king agrees, and the outing is a delight, until one of the rowers loses a treasured pendant of turquoise in the water and falls silent with grief. And then the wise man works a wonder, folding back the waters of the lake so that the pendant can be recovered before letting the waters flow together again. It is a gentle, almost whimsical tale, and what matters for us is the picture it paints of the king, not a distant tyrant, but an approachable, human figure. A king at ease among his court, moved by the sorrow of a serving woman, delighting in a day on the water. This is how the Egyptians chose to remember Sneferu, 1,000 years and more after he lived, as a good and gentle king close to his people, a figure of warmth and wonder. Few rulers are remembered so kindly, and the very existence of such a tale tells us how deep and how affectionate his memory ran. And the kingdom he ruled was, by the memory of later ages, a prosperous and happy one, a golden time, the wealth flowing in from the frontiers and the trade, the surplus grain of the fertile valley, the organized labor of the great projects, all of it made for a kingdom at the height of its early power and plenty. The building program itself, vast as it was not only a drain but a kind of engine, gathering and organizing the kingdom, training its administrators, binding its people to a common and sacred purpose, and distributing the surplus of the land through the feeding and provisioning of the great work gangs. Some scholars have argued that the building of the pyramids did as much to forge and unify the Egyptian state as the state did to build the pyramids. And if that is so, then Sneferu, the greatest builder of them all, was also one of the great state builders, forging through his projects the centralized kingdom that would reach its peak under his descendants. The golden age the later Egyptians remembered was not only a matter of good harvests and gentle kings, it was the peak of a whole civilization, organized and prosperous and confident, raising mountains of stone toward the sun. There is a poignant footnote to all this prosperity and power, and it concerns the fragility of even the greatest reigns. For all that Sneferu built, for all the wealth he gathered, and the family he raised, much of the physical world of his reign has vanished. The cities and towns and palaces of the Old Kingdom, built largely of mud brick, have mostly dissolved back into the earth, or lie buried and waterlogged beneath the modern landscape, hard to reach and harder to excavate. It is above all through the great stone monuments, the pyramids and the temples and the tombs, that his reign survives, for stone endures where mud brick does not. So the Sneferu we can see is, in a sense, the Sneferu of stone, the pyramids, the reliefs, the tombs of his family. The living kingdom, the busy cities and the green fields and the crowded harbors and the loud markets, we must largely imagine for ourselves, reconstructing it patiently, piece by patient piece, from the great stone monuments and the scattered written records that happened to survive. But those monuments are enough to show us a reign of extraordinary reach and power, a golden age remembered with warmth for 1,000 years and more. And when the long reign at last came to its end, the throne passed to the heir, and with it passed everything Sneferu had built and learned. His son took up the crown, and the vast machinery of the kingdom, the organized workforce, the perfected true pyramid technology, the administrative state, the reach across the frontiers, all of it, ready and waiting, and he turned it to the building of the Great Pyramid at Giza. There is a real sense in which the Great Pyramid was Sneferu's achievement as much as his son's, for it was built with his tools, his techniques, his workforce, his lessons, on the foundation of his 3 great experiments. Without the collapse at Midian and the bend at Dashur and the triumph of the Red Pyramid, there could have been no Great Pyramid. The son climbed to a height his father had made reachable, And so the passing of the throne from Sneferu to his son was not a break, but a continuation. The handing on of a great project from one generation to the next, from the father who invented the true pyramid to the son who raised it to its ultimate scale. It is worth remembering as well that the transition of power in this family was not always smooth, for the later history of the Fourth Dynasty holds hints of rivalry and disputed succession among Sneferu's descendants, of princes who died in branches that competed for the throne. But in the immediate passage from Sneferu to his heir, the kingdom seems to have held together, strong and prosperous, and the building went on without pause. From the father's pyramids to the sons, the stability Sneferu had built, in stone and in the state, carried the dynasty forward into its greatest age. That, too, is part of his legacy. Not only the monuments he raised, but the strong and organized kingdom he passed on, ready for even greater things. Sneferu's age was also a great age of art, and the tombs of his family and officials preserve some of the finest work of the whole Old Kingdom. The painted reliefs and statues from the mastabas around Maydam are famous for their beauty and their lifelike quality. The seated figures with their inlaid eyes, the delicate scenes of daily life carved and painted on the tomb walls, the geese of Maydam, a painting of birds so finely observed that it is considered one of the masterpieces of ancient Egyptian art. These works show a civilization at the height of its artistic powers, confident, precise, and full of quiet observation of the living world. To look at them is to see the world of Sneferu not only in its mountains of stone but in its smaller beauties, its birds and its faces and its scenes of the fields and the marshes, rendered with a skill that has rarely been surpassed. The golden age of Sneferu was an age of art as much as of building, and its finest works, its painted geese and its inlaid faces, still move us with their quiet, careful, watchful perfection. Even now, 4,500 years later. So the wider story of Sneferu is the story of a whole reaching, prosperous, organized kingdom gathered around the king and his great works. Armies to the south and the west, bringing captives and cattle. Mines in the Sinai, yielding copper and turquoise. Ships across the sea, bringing cedar from the distant coast. A named vessel, praise of the two lands, sailing the river 4,500 years ago. A centralized administration governed in large part by the royal family, and at the center, Sneferu and Hetepheres, and their son, the future builder of the Great Pyramid, and a whole royal generation that would raise the pyramids of Giza and rule Egypt at its peak. This is the world the pyramids rose from, the busy and powerful kingdom of the man who built mountains. All of it flowed on into the reign of his son and the building of the Great Pyramid, so that Sneferu stands at the head of the whole golden age of Giza, its founder and its father. But how do we know all this? How were the pyramids studied, the records read, the tombs discovered, the story pieced together? That is the story we turn to next, the evidence in the strange and wonderful things it has revealed. So we have followed Sneferu through his pyramids and his kingdom, his armies and his ships and his family. But everything we have said rests on evidence, on the patient work of scholars and excavators across the last 2 centuries, reading the stone and the records and the tombs. So now let us turn to that evidence itself, to the discoveries and the science and the debates. For the recovery of Sneferu's reign is a fascinating story in its own right, and within it lie some of the strangest and most wonderful things in all of Egyptology. Let us begin with the pyramids themselves, for they are the great primary evidence. And modern study has revealed their secrets slowly and with difficulty. The 3 great monuments, at Maydam and Dashur, have been surveyed, measured, entered, and studied by generations of scholars who have traced their internal passages, mapped their chambers, analyzed their construction, and read the workmen's marks on their stones. It was through such careful study that scholars established the true pyramid experiment at Maydam, the change of angle in the bent pyramid, and the perfected form of the red pyramid, and pieced together the story of Sneferu's learning that we have followed tonight. For much of the 20th century, the pyramids at Dashur were difficult to reach, lying within a military zone, and were less studied than the pyramids of Giza. Only in more recent decades have they been fully opened to scholars, and eventually to visitors. The Bent Pyramid was opened to tourists in recent years for the first time in decades. And now, if you are willing to bend low and walk a long, narrow, descending passage, you can enter the ancient chambers within, and stand inside a monument that Sneferu's builders raised 4,500 years ago. The study of these monuments has been the work of many hands across many generations. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the great pioneering excavator Flinders Petrie worked at Meidum, measuring the pyramid and the tombs around it with the careful precision that made him one of the fathers of scientific archaeology in Egypt. And it was in part through his work that the strange story of the Meidum Pyramid began to be understood. At Dachau, in the later 20th century, the German scholar Rainer Stadelmann devoted much of his life to the study of Sneferu's pyramids, mapping their construction and arguing for the long reign that the building required. And it was he who proposed the longest of the reign estimates, some 48 years, a figure most now think too high but which reflects the sheer volume of building to be explained. And it was an American expedition, led by the great excavator George Reisner, that in the 20th century uncovered the hidden treasure of Queen Hetepheres at Giza, one of the crowning discoveries of a distinguished career. These are only a few of the many scholars whose patient work, over more than a century, has recovered the reign of Sneferu from the silence of the past. Behind every fact we have spoken tonight lies the labor of such people, measuring, digging, recording, and puzzling out the story stone by stone. The recovery of Sneferu's reign is in this sense a story of modern patience matching ancient patience. The slow, careful work of the excavators, mirroring the slow, careful work of the builders. Neither the pyramids nor our knowledge of them was made in a day. Both were built up gradually, course by course and discovery by discovery, through the sustained effort of many people across many years. And just as the builders left their marks on the stone, the excavators left their records in their notebooks and their reports, so that the knowledge could be passed on and built upon. It is a quiet and human thing, this long labor of understanding, and it is worth honoring alongside the monuments themselves. Now let us turn to the single most spectacular discovery connected with Sneferu's reign. One of the greatest finds in all of Egyptology, the hidden treasure of Queen Hetepheres, Sneferu's wife. The story of its discovery is worth telling slowly, for it is one of the most remarkable in the history of archaeology. In the 20th century, an expedition working at Giza, near the Great Pyramid built by Hetepheres' son, came upon a hidden shaft, sealed and concealed, descending deep into the rock. When they reached the bottom and opened the chamber at its base, they found it filled with the funeral furniture of a queen, a magnificent collection of objects in gold and precious materials, a bed, a carrying chair, 2 armchairs, a canopy frame, boxes, vessels, jewelry, all of the finest workmanship, wrapped and stacked and hidden away and preserved in that sealed chamber. For 4,500 years, it was the burial equipment of Queen Hetepheres, the wife of Sneferu, and the mother of the builder of the Great Pyramid, one of the richest and most complete sets of Old Kingdom royal furniture ever found. And there was a mystery within the treasure, a mystery that has never been fully solved. For when the excavators examined the queen's sealed sarcophagus, the great stone coffin found within the chamber, they discovered that it was empty. The furniture was there. The jewelry was there. Even the queen's preserved internal organs appear to have been there, in their container. But the queen's body was gone. The sarcophagus that should have held her mummy was empty. What had happened? The leading idea, put forward by the excavators, was that the queen's original burial elsewhere had been robbed or disturbed, and that her son, the king, had ordered her surviving funeral goods gathered up and secretly reburied in this hidden shaft at Giza to keep them safe, without realizing or without revealing that the body itself had already been lost. Others have proposed different explanations, but the mystery remains: a queen's treasure, hidden and preserved, and an empty coffin at its heart. It is a strange echo of the wider pattern we have seen, the pattern of the missing royal bodies, the kings and queens whose monuments and treasures survive, but whose mortal remains have vanished into the long ages. The treasure of Hedopheres deserves a moment more, for the quality of what survived is extraordinary. When the objects were recovered, many of the wooden pieces had decayed in the damp of the chamber, but the sheets of gold that had covered them survived, and from these the excavators were able, with immense patience, to reconstruct the furniture: a bed with a footboard, chairs with graceful arms, a carrying chair in which the queen would have been borne on the shoulders of her servants, a great canopy frame that would have held curtains around her bed, and boxes that had held her possessions, one of them containing silver bracelets inlaid with butterflies of turquoise and other stones. These are objects of the highest craftsmanship, made for a queen of the very summit of the Old Kingdom, and they give us a glimpse, rare and precious, of the luxury and the beauty that surrounded the royal family of Sneferu. Most of what such families owned has vanished. Here, by the accident of a hidden reburial, a fragment of it survived, and through it we can almost see the world of the queen, the fine furniture of her chambers, the jewelry she wore, the chair in which she was carried through the palace. It is one of the most intimate glimpses we have of any person of that distant age, and the empty coffin at the heart of it all continues to haunt the imagination. A queen's complete funeral treasure, hidden and preserved with such care, and yet no queen within it. Whatever the true explanation, whether robbery and secret reburial, or some other cause, the empty sarcophagus of Hedopheres stands as a symbol of one of the deepest patterns in the whole story of the Pyramid Age: the survival of the monuments and the treasures, and the disappearance of the bodies they were built to protect. The kings and queens who raised the greatest tombs in history to preserve themselves for eternity are the very ones whose bodies we cannot find. There is a strange and moving irony in that, and we will return to it as we close. The numbers are striking when you consider the precision and the scale of what Sneferu's builders achieved. Consider the Red Pyramid, a monument containing on the order of 1.5 million cubic meters of stone, rising at a carefully maintained constant angle to a height of over 100 meters, its base laid out as a great square with sides many hundreds of feet long, and yet built with a regularity and an alignment that still impresses modern engineers. Consider that all of this was done without iron tools, without the wheel, in any significant construction role, without modern surveying instruments, using copper and stone tools, ramps of earth and brick, and the organized muscle of thousands of workers. Consider that Sneferu's builders did this not once but 3 times over in a single reign, moving in total more stone than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The scale and the precision, achieved with such simple means, are among the great wonders of the ancient world, and they were achieved by human beings, learning as they went, through trial and error, 4,500 years ago. Consider, too, the matter of orientation, for the Great Pyramids are aligned with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal directions, their sides facing close to true north, south, east, and west. To achieve such alignment without the compass, without modern instruments, the builders must have used the sky, observing the stars or the sun to find true north and laying out the base accordingly. This was already being worked out in Sneferu's reign, and it would reach astonishing precision in the Great Pyramid of his son. That a people without our instruments could align a monument of many acres so closely to the poles of the earth is one of the quiet marvels of the age, and it speaks not of magic but of patient observation, of careful measurement, of a deep and practical knowledge of the sky, accumulated and applied by skilled human beings. The precision is real, and it is astonishing, and it is entirely human. And consider the corbelled chambers within the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, those high rooms whose walls step inward course by course to a soaring ceiling far overhead. To build such a chamber and to carry over it the enormous weight of the pyramid above without collapse required a real understanding of how to distribute great loads through stone. The builders solved this problem by trial and by growing skill in Sneferu's reign, and their solution, the corbelled space, would be raised to its ultimate grandeur in the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid. Here again, In the interior spaces as on the outer faces, we see the marks of human ingenuity working out hard problems step by step and getting better at it across the reign. The evidence inside the pyramids tells the same story as the evidence outside, a difficult craft, learned by human beings through patient effort and mastered at last. And it is precisely here, at the meeting of great achievement and simple means, that the strange theories gather as they gather around all the pyramids of Egypt. For there are those who claim that such monuments could not have been built by the people of that age, that the precision and the scale are beyond what ancient Egyptians could have achieved, and that some other explanation must be found, visitors from beyond the earth, or a lost and vanished civilization of forgotten powers, or some secret technology since lost. These ideas attach themselves above all to the pyramids of Giza, but they reach back to Sneferu's pyramids too, as the ancestors of Giza. And so we should meet them honestly and see what the evidence actually says. And here, Sneferu's pyramids are, of all the pyramids, among the best possible answers to such claims, for they show us, more clearly than any others, human beings learning to build with all their trial and error on open display. Think about it. If the pyramids had been built by some perfect superhuman power, arriving with complete knowledge, we would not expect to find failure among them. We would not expect a collapsed pyramid at Medum. We would not expect a pyramid that changed its angle halfway up because the builders feared it would fall. We would not expect the visible marks of correction and learning. But that is exactly what we find in Sneferu's reign: a collapse, a bend, a correction, and finally a success. The three pyramids are the record of human beings feeling their way toward a solution they did not yet have, making mistakes, and learning from them. That is not the signature of superhuman perfection. It is the signature of human beings, brilliant and fallible, learning a difficult craft over the years of a reign. The failures are the proof of the humanity. No visitor from the stars would have needed 3 tries. Sneferu did, and the record of his 3 tries is written in the desert for anyone to read. The mainstream understanding held by essentially all serious scholars is that the pyramids were built by skilled and organized human beings, over years using ramps and sledges and levers and copper tools and immense coordinated labor, feeding and directing thousands of workers through a sophisticated administration. This is not a failure of imagination. It is the conclusion the evidence forces upon us, and it is a far greater tribute to the ancient Egyptians than any tale of lost civilizations or visitors from the stars. To say that the Egyptians could not have built the pyramids is, in the end, to insult the very people who did, to take from them the credit for one of the greatest achievements in the history of our species. The real story, the human story, of a people learning to raise mountains of stone is more impressive than any myth. And Sneferu's 3 pyramids, with their honest record of failure and correction, are among the best evidence we have that the achievement was gloriously human. There is another kind of evidence, humble but powerful, that points the same way: the marks the workers themselves left on the stones. Throughout the pyramids of Sneferu and his successors, the work gangs daubed their names and notes in red paint on the blocks. Names that survive to this day. These gangs had names, often names expressing devotion to the king, and by these names we can see the human organization of the work, the crews and teams into which the labor was divided, taking pride in what they built. In the Red Pyramid, as we have seen, they left dates telling us when the work was done. These are not the marks of slaves driven in silence, nor of visitors from the stars, but of Egyptian workers, organized and provisioned, and, by the evidence, proud of their labor, who left their names on the mountains they raised. To read those names is to hear, faintly, the voices of the people who actually built the pyramids, and they tell us plainly that the builders were human beings, gathered and organized and fed by their kingdom, doing the great work of their age. We should also be honest, as we always must, about how much remains unknown and unfound. For all the study of Sneferu's pyramids, mysteries remain. We do not know for certain how and when the Medum pyramid collapsed, or exactly why the bent pyramid's angle was changed. We do not know why the bent pyramid has two entrances. We do not have the body of Sneferu, or a certain answer to which pyramid held him, or what became of his mortal remains. We do not fully understand the empty sarcophagus of Queen Hetepheres, and much of the physical world of his reign, the cities and palaces and towns, lies buried or dissolved or beneath the water table, hard to reach and largely unexcavated. Egypt still holds its secrets, and the age of Sneferu, for all we have learned, is far from fully known. New discoveries still emerge from the sands, and it may be that somewhere, in an unexcavated tomb or an unread inscription, lie answers to questions we cannot yet resolve. The story of Sneferu is not closed. It is still being written, still being dug from the ground, still yielding its wonders. It is worth adding that modern experiment has steadily closed the gap between the achievement and the means. Scholars and experimental archaeologists have tested how copper tools cut and shaped stone, how sledges dragged great blocks across wetted ground, how ramps of earth and brick could raise stone to great heights, and how the alignment to the stars could be achieved with simple sighting instruments. Again and again, these experiments have shown that the methods available to the ancient Egyptians, applied with skill and on a large enough scale, were sufficient to build the pyramids. There is no need to invoke lost technologies or otherworldly visitors. The copper chisel, the stone pounder, the wooden sledge, the earthen ramp, the sighting of the stars, the organized labor of thousands, fed by the surplus of the fertile valley, and above all the accumulated skill and experience of generations of builders. These were enough. Sneferu's 3 pyramids, with their record of trial and error, show us the skill being accumulated. The Great Pyramid of his son shows us that skill at its height. There is no gap that requires a miracle to fill. There is only the long, patient, human mastery of a difficult craft. We should return, as well, to the humbling fact of how much of Egypt still lies buried and unknown. The great stone monuments survive because they are stone, and because they stand above the desert sands. But the ordinary world of the Old Kingdom, the cities and towns and villages, the palaces and workshops and harbors, was built largely of mud brick, and much of it has dissolved, or lies buried under later settlement, or sits below the water table in the valley, waterlogged and nearly impossible to excavate. This means that our picture of Sneferu's reign is, in a real sense, a picture built almost entirely from tombs and temples and pyramids, from the architecture of death and eternity, with the living world of the reign only dimly glimpsed. There may be a great deal still to find, and the sands of Egypt continue, even now, to yield new discoveries, new tombs, new inscriptions, new fragments of the ancient world. It is entirely possible that future discoveries will change parts of the story we have told tonight, resolving old mysteries or opening new ones. The reign of Sneferu is not a closed book. It is a story still being recovered, still being read, still holding secrets beneath the sand. And that, perhaps, is part of the enduring fascination of ancient Egypt, that so much remains unknown, that the ground still holds its wonders, that even a reign as great and as studied as Sneferu's still keeps its mysteries. We do not have his body. We do not fully understand his monuments. We cannot see his living cities. And yet, from what survives, we can recover a king of extraordinary achievement and warmth, the greatest builder of the ancient world, remembered for 1,000 years as good. That we can know so much and still have so much to wonder at is one of the quiet gifts of this ancient civilization, and one of the reasons its story is so restful and so endless to dwell upon in the late hours of the night. We should not forget the written evidence either, for the reign of Sneferu is documented in some of the oldest historical records in the world. The royal annals, preserved in fragments like the stone kept at Palermo, give us a year by year record of his reign, the campaigns, the cedar fleet, the making of statues and doors, the counting of the cattle by which the years were reckoned. Later king lists, written down centuries afterward, preserve his name and his place at the head of the 4th dynasty, though they disagree about the length of his reign. Middle Kingdom texts remember him as the beneficent king and tell tales of his court. Inscriptions in the Sinai record his expeditions to the mines, and the workmen's marks in his pyramids give us dates from his own reign in the hand of the men who built for him. Taken together, this written evidence, spanning from his own age to more than 1,000 years after, lets us place Sneferu in real history, a documented king of documented deeds, not a figure of legend only. It is a remarkable thing to have such records from so near the dawn of history, and they are part of why we can tell his story with as much confidence as we can. There is a deeper point hidden in all of this about why the human story matters so much. When people claim that the ancient Egyptians could not have built the pyramids, they usually mean it as praise for the monuments, as a way of saying how astonishing they are. But it is, in truth, the opposite of praise, for it takes the achievement away from the people who earned it. The real wonder of the pyramids is not that they are too perfect to be human, but that they are human, that ordinary people, with simple tools and immense organization and hard-won skill, raised these mountains toward the sky. Sneferu's 3 pyramids, with their failures and corrections on open display, are the clearest proof of all that this was a human achievement. The work of a people learning, striving, failing, and finally succeeding. And that, in the end, is a far more inspiring story than any tale of lost civilizations or visitors from beyond the earth. It is the story of what human beings can do. It is worth saying plainly, too, that Sneferu's pyramids are still giving up new knowledge in our own time. In recent years, as the Dashur monuments have been more fully opened and studied, and as new techniques of survey and imaging have been applied to the pyramids, scholars have continued to refine their understanding of how these monuments were built and how they changed during construction. The Bent Pyramid, opened again to visitors after long being closed, has drawn fresh attention and fresh study. Every generation of scholars brings new tools and new questions to these ancient stones, and the story is richer now than it was a century ago, and will likely be richer still a century from now. The past in Egypt is not fixed and finished. It grows as we learn to read it better. So that is the evidence, and the strangeness within it. 3 great pyramids, studied and measured and entered, revealing the story of a king learning to build. The hidden treasure of Queen Hetepheres, and the mystery of her empty coffin, the staggering precision and scale of the monuments, achieved with the simplest of means. The strange theories met and answered by the honest record of human failure and correction written in Sneferu's 3 pyramids, and the honest acknowledgement of how much remains unknown, how much still lies buried beneath the sand. From all of this, patiently assembled, we have recovered the story of the man who built mountains. And now, as our night draws toward its close, let us step back and ask what it all means. So we come, in the quiet of the late hour, to the deeper meaning of it all. We have followed Sneferu from his uncertain birth to his golden memory, through 3 great mountains of stone, across a reaching and prosperous kingdom, into the discoveries and debates of the scholars. What does it all mean? What endures from the reign of the man who built mountains, and what can we carry with us as we drift toward sleep? Let us begin with the thing that sets Sneferu apart from almost every other great figure of the ancient world: the visible record of his learning. Most greatness comes to us finished and perfect, with the struggle hidden. We see the triumph, not the failures behind it. But Sneferu left his failures standing in the desert, beside his triumph for all time. The collapsed tower at Midim, the bent monument at Dashur, and then at last the perfect red pyramid. 3 pyramids that are, together, the record of a mind learning to do something no one had ever done, through trial and error and honest failure. Let that sink in for a moment. The greatest builder in the history of Egypt became great not by never failing, but by failing and learning and trying again until he got it right. His monuments are not only tombs and temples, they are a lesson, written in stone, about how mastery is really achieved, not in a single flash of genius, but slowly, patiently, through the willingness to fail and to learn. There is something deeply human and deeply comforting in that lesson. something worth carrying into sleep. We live in a world that often hides its failures and shows only its successes, that presents mastery as if it came easily, as if the great achievers never stumbled. Sneferu's 3 pyramids tell a truer and kinder story. They tell us that even the greatest achievements are built on failure, that the road to mastery runs through mistakes, that the willingness to keep going after a collapse is itself a kind of greatness. The king who built the first perfect pyramid also built the pyramid that fell, and the one that bent, and he did not hide them, and he did not stop. There is a quiet wisdom in that. 4,500 years old, and it is as true today as it was then. Consider, too, what Sneferu made possible, and how his greatest achievement became in a way invisible, hidden behind the fame of his son. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the most famous monument on earth, and it was built by Sneferu's son. On the foundation Sneferu laid. Every technique, every lesson, every organized crew, every perfected method that raised the Great Pyramid came from the father's reign. And yet, it is the son who is remembered, the son whose pyramid draws the eyes of the world, while the father stands in the shadow. This is not science fiction, this quiet injustice of memory. It is the ordinary way of the world, in which the one who takes the final step is remembered, and the one who made the step possible is forgotten. There is something moving in Sneferu's position, the father of the pyramid age, the man who did the hardest work, the learning and the failing, and the first perfecting, remembered less than the son who inherited his mastery. To bring him out of that shadow, to give him his due, is part of why we have spent this night with him. And yet, in another sense, Sneferu was not forgotten at all, and this is one of the most beautiful parts of his story. For while the modern world remembers his son, the ancient Egyptians remembered the father, and they remembered him with a warmth they gave to few others. For 1,000 years and more after his death, they spoke his name with affection, remembered his reign as a golden age, told gentle tales of his court, and honored him as the beneficent king, the good and beautiful ruler. Let that sink in as well. That of all the mighty kings of Egypt, many of them more famous today, it was Sneferu, the patient builder, the gentle king, whom his own people remembered most fondly across 1,000 years. He was loved. That is a rare thing for a king, and rarer still for a king who moved more stone than any other, who sent armies to the frontiers and gathered captives and cattle, and drove the greatest building program in history. That such a king should be remembered, above all, as good, tells us something about the man, and something hopeful about what his people valued, what was lost. When Sneferu passed into the long silence of the past, his body, for one, which we cannot find in any of his 3 great mountains, his living kingdom, the cities and palaces and green fields, dissolved back into the earth, the gleaming white casings of his pyramids, stripped away over the centuries, so that we see only the rough cores where once there were mountains of light. The full knowledge of how and why his monuments took the shapes they did, lost to time and debate. Much was lost, as much is always lost across 4,500 years. And yet how much endures? The 3 great pyramids still stand in the desert. The story of his learning is still legible in their shapes. The treasure of his queen still gleams in the museum. The tales of his goodness still come down to us. His name is still spoken, still studied, still wondered at. For a man who lived so unimaginably long ago, an astonishing amount of Sneferu endures. And what endures most of all, perhaps, is the shape he gave the world. The true pyramid, the smooth-sided mountain rising to a point, is one of the most recognizable shapes ever made by human hands. An image known to nearly every person on earth, and it was Sneferu who perfected it, who turned the stepped pyramids of the past into the true pyramids of the future, who first raised a smooth mountain of stone against the sky. Every true pyramid that followed, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, including all the pyramids of Egypt, descends from his experiments in the desert. When you picture a pyramid that clean and perfect shape, you are picturing something that Sneferu, more than any other single person brought into the world. That is his monument. Larger than any one pyramid. The shape itself, the idea of the true pyramid, given to humanity and never lost. Let that sink in one final time, as the night deepens, that a king who lived 4,500 years ago, of uncertain birth, remembered as gentle and good, gave the world one of its most enduring shapes through patience and failure and the refusal to stop. This is not science fiction. This is real history. The true story of a real man written in stone we can still touch today. There is a further thought worth holding about the relationship between the Father and the Son, and what it teaches us about how history remembers. We tend to remember the summit and forget the climb. We remember the Great Pyramid and forget the 3 pyramids that made it possible. We remember the one who stood at the top and forget the many who built the road up. But the truth is that almost nothing great is ever achieved alone, or in a single generation. The Great Pyramid rests on Sneferu's lifetime of learning. And Sneferu's learning rested, in turn, on the stepped pyramids of the kings before him, and on the accumulated skill of generations of quarrymen and masons and scribes. Every great monument is the work of many hands across many years, most of them forgotten. To remember, Sneferu is, in a way, to remember all those forgotten builders, all the patient work behind the famous triumphs, all the failures and corrections that never make it into the story. It is to honor the climb, and not only the summit. And there is a gentle thought, too, about the nature of memory itself, and how a person can outlive their own body by thousands of years. Sneferu's body is gone. We cannot find it. And yet Sneferu is, in a real sense, still here. His name is spoken. His pyramids stand, his story is told, tonight, to you. He has outlived his own mortal remains by 4,500 years, not through any magic, but through the simple, powerful act of being remembered. The Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to keep them alive, that a person lived on as long as their name was spoken. Whatever we make of their beliefs, there is a truth in that idea that we can feel, that memory is a kind of continuation, that the dead live on in the stories we tell of them. And so, in telling Sneferu's story, we do for him something very like what his own people believed kept the dead alive. We speak his name, we keep him here, a little longer, in the quiet of the night think, as well, about the strange contrast at the heart of his story, the mountains of stone that endure, and the body that does not. Sneferu poured the wealth and the labor of a kingdom into building himself an eternal house. 3 of them, in fact, mountains meant to preserve his name and his body forever. The mountains have endured more or less for 4,500 years, but the body they were built to protect is gone, vanished, lost. In this, Sneferu's story holds a quiet lesson about what really lasts. It was not the stone that preserved him, in the end, nor the treasure, nor the sealed chamber. It was the memory, the story, the names spoken across the centuries. The most massive tombs in the world could not keep his body, but the intangible things, the memory of his goodness, the record of his achievement, the shape he gave the world. These have lasted, and will last, as long as the story is told. There is something worth carrying into sleep in that what endures of a life is often not the grand and solid things we build to last, but the gentler, lighter things, the memory of who we were and what we did and how we were loved. There is one more thread worth drawing together here, about the whole shape of the night we have spent. We began with a single astonishing fact that one king, little known today, moved more stone than any pharaoh in history, and gave the world the true pyramid. From that beginning, we followed the whole arc of his life, his uncertain birth, his careful marriage, his long and peaceful reign, his 3 great experiments in stone, his armies and his ships, his family and his golden memory. And through it all ran a single thread, patience, the patience to fail and learn, the patience to build and rebuild, and build again until the form was perfect. The patience of a long reign turned steadily toward a great purpose. The patience of a whole kingdom, organized and directed across decades toward the raising of mountains. And the patience, too, of the scholars who recovered his story, digging and measuring and puzzling it out across more than a century. It is a story steeped in patience from beginning to end, and perhaps that is why it rests so easily on the mind in the quiet hours, because it moves at the pace of the river and the desert, and the slow rising of the stone, without haste, without struggle, towards something lasting and good. And in that patience there is a kind of peace that we can take for ourselves. So much of our own lives is spent in hurry, in the wish for things to be finished, in frustration at our failures and our slow progress. Sneferu's story offers a gentler way of seeing. His failures were not disasters but lessons. His slow progress was not weakness, but the very path to mastery. His long, patient labor built something that has lasted 4,500 years. There is no need to rush toward the summit. There is only the next course of stone, the next patient step laid carefully upon the last. Do that long enough, quietly and with care and without despair, and in time whole mountains rise. That is the quiet wisdom of the man who built mountains, and it is a good thought to rest upon. So the deeper meaning of Sneferu's reign is, in the end, a meaning about patience and learning, and the human capacity to achieve great things not in spite of failure but through it. It is a meaning about being remembered for goodness, even amid great power. It is a meaning about the ones who lay the foundations, often forgotten behind the ones who take the final step. And it is a meaning about what endures, the shapes we give the world, the works of our hands, the memory of our goodness, lasting far beyond our brief lives, far beyond even our own bodies, which vanish while the mountains we build remain. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson of all, the one most fitting for the edge of sleep. Sneferu was the mightiest builder of his age, and yet what his own people loved him for was not his might, but his goodness. They could have remembered him as the king who moved more stone than any other, the conqueror of the frontiers, the master of the mines and the ships. Instead, they remembered him as the beneficent king, the good and gentle ruler, the maker of beautiful things. Of all that he built and gathered and achieved, it was his kindness that lasted longest in the memory of his people. There is a quiet hope in that for all of us, that in the end it is not our power or our achievements that others hold on to most, but our goodness, the way we treated the people around us, the gentleness we showed. Sneferu built mountains, and they remember him as kind. Let that be the last thought we take from him, down into the quiet of the night. These are gentle and worthy things to carry down into sleep. From the reign of the man who built mountains, and now the night grows deep, and it is time to let the story settle and to draw it gently to its close. Let the images return one last time, softly, the way familiar things return to the mind on the edge of sleep. Let us walk once more, slowly, through the world of Sneferu, and then let it fade, like the light fading from the desert at the end of the day. Picture the desert at dawn, 4,500 years ago. The sky pale in the east, the sand cool and gray in the early light, and rising from the desert, catching the first light of the sun, the smooth white faces of the pyramids, gleaming perfect, mountains of light against the fading stars. This is what Sneferu made, not the rough brown ruins we see today, but blazing white mountains, smooth and radiant, the first true pyramids in the world, shining in the dawn. Hold that image as you drift, the white pyramids catching the light, rising from the quiet desert at the beginning of the day. Remember the man himself, as his people remembered him, the beneficent king, the good and gentle ruler, the maker of beautiful things. Remember the king of the old tale, at ease on the palace lake, moved by the sorrow of a serving woman, delighting in a quiet day on the water. Remember the king who failed, and learned, and tried again, who left his collapsed pyramid standing in the desert, and did not hide it, who built on patiently through failure and correction, until the smooth mountain rose perfect against the sky. Remember the greatest builder in the history of Egypt, who moved more stone than any king before or after, and who was remembered above all for his goodness. Remember the 3 mountains, and the story written in them. The pyramid at Midum, which reached for the true form and fell, and stands now as a strange tower above its mound of rubble. The bent pyramid at Dashur, which changed its angle halfway to the sky, and wears still, almost alone among the pyramids, its gleaming white casing, and the red pyramid, the Triumph, the first true smooth pyramid ever completed, glowing warm and red in the light of the setting sun. 3 chapters of a single story, 3 stages in the learning of a craft, 3 monuments that together contain more stone than the Great Pyramid itself. The record in stone of a man learning to build a mountain. Remember the kingdom around him, reaching and prosperous and full of life. The armies going out to the frontiers and returning with their captives and their cattle. The miners in the Sinai carving the king's image into the rock. The ships crossing the sea to bring the cedar from the distant coast. The great vessel named Praise of the Two Lands sailing the river under the wide sky. The scribes counting the harvest, the provinces bringing their offerings, the workers raising the stone. A whole civilization, at the height of its early power, gathered around the king and his great works, in the golden age that later Egyptians would remember with such warmth. Remember the family too gathered around Sneferu and his queen, Hedephirs, whose hidden treasure would gleam again after 4,500 years, whose empty coffin still keeps its secret, the son who would build the Great Pyramid, inheriting his father's mastery, the princes and princesses, the viziers and the royal wives, the whole ruling house of the greatest age of the Old Kingdom, flowing from Sneferu's line, a family at the summit of the ancient world, living its human dramas of birth and marriage and death and succession beneath the rising pyramids. And remember the mystery that remains, the quiet riddle at the heart of it all. 3 great pyramids, and no king within them. The greatest builder of tombs in history, who raised 3 mountains to house his eternity, and whose body we cannot find in any of them. Somewhere across the long ages, Sneferu slipped away from the monuments he built, lost, like so many of the pyramid kings, to robbers and to time. His mountains remain, and his name remains, and his memory remains, but the man himself, the mortal body of the king, is gone, vanished into the silence of the past. It is one of the enduring wonders of his story, and a fitting one, perhaps, for a king who gave the world so much and asks now only to be remembered. For that, in the end, is what remains, and what we can give him remembrance. The pyramids will stand for ages yet, but stone, in time, wears away. What truly endures is the story told and retold of who he was and what he did. The man who built mountains, the king who learned to build through patient failure, the gentle ruler remembered for 1,000 years as good, the father of the pyramid age, who gave the world one of its most enduring shapes. As long as the story is told, Sneferu is not truly gone. And tonight you have helped to keep it. By listening, by letting his story fill the quiet hours, by carrying his memory a little further into time. Let us linger a little longer in that quiet, before we let it all go, and let the calm of the desert night settle fully over us. There is no hurry now. The story is told, the work is done, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Think of the desert at night, vast and still, the sand cool under the stars, the great pyramids, dark shapes against the deep blue of the sky. Think of how many nights have passed over them. 4,500 years of nights, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the pyramids standing patient and silent through all of them. And think of how small our own night is within all that time, and yet how peaceful here at the end of the day, with the ancient story still warm in the mind. The pyramids have kept their long vigil through the ages, and they keep it still tonight. While you rest, they ask nothing of the nights that passed over them, and they ask nothing of this one. They simply stand, patient and silent, as they have always stood, letting the stars wheel slowly above them and the quiet hours pass. The way you might let this quiet hour pass now, asking nothing of it, simply resting beneath the same eternal sky. Think of the river too, the great Nile flowing quietly through the dark, as it has flowed for all the ages of Egypt, carrying its waters north toward the sea under the same stars that shone on Sneferu. The river does not hurry. It flows slowly, steadily, patiently, the way the great stone barges once moved upon it, the way the pyramids rose, the way mastery itself is achieved, without haste over the long course of years. Let your breathing slow to that ancient rhythm, the rhythm of the river, unhurried and calm, flowing gently on through the quiet dark, in and out, slow and deep, like the water moving softly past the reeds in the warm and starlit night. There is a deep peace in that slowness, the peace of things that last, the peace of the river and the desert and the patient stone. And think, one last time, of the man at the center of it all, resting now for 4,500 years, wherever he lies. The gentle king, the patient builder, the maker of mountains, and the maker of beautiful things. He did his great work, and he was remembered for his goodness. And now he rests. As all things rest in the end, there is no sorrow in it. Only a deep and ancient peace, the peace of a life well lived and long remembered. The peace of the desert at night, the peace of the river flowing on. He built his mountains, and they still stand. He earned his memory, and it still endures. And he rests. Now, in the long quiet, as you will rest tonight, breathe slowly now, and let each breath carry you a little deeper toward sleep, the way each course of stone carried the pyramid a little higher toward the sky. There is no need to reach the summit tonight. There is only the slow and steady rising, the calm and patient drift, one breath after another, into the deep quiet of the night. The gentle king knew the value of patience, of doing one thing at a time, of letting the great work rise slowly and without haste. Let your rest be like that. Unhurried, patient, deep, rising gently into sleep as the pyramids rose gently toward the stars. So let it all grow still. Let the white pyramids fade into the dark. Let the river flow quietly on. Let the gentle king rest, and let the ancient kingdom sleep, and let the desert grow silent and dim around you. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to hold, nothing more to think. The story is told, and it will keep, and you may return to it whenever you wish, on some other quiet night. For now, let it go, softly, and let yourself drift down into the deep and gentle dark, carried on the slow current of the ancient river beneath the patient and eternal stars. So let the images fade now gently, one by one. The white pyramids in the dawn light slowly dimming. The gentle king on the quiet lake growing still. The three mountains in the desert settling into the dark, the reaching kingdom, the family, the ships, the stone, all growing quiet, all growing dim as the night deepens around you and sleep draws near. Let them go softly, knowing the story will still be there waiting. Whenever you wish to return to it, there is no need to hold on. Let the desert grow dark, let the pyramids fade into the night. Let the great and gentle king rest, as you rest now, in the deep quiet at the end of the day. The story of Sneferu, the man who built mountains, is told. The white pyramids stand in the darkness. The desert is quiet. The long night has come. Rest now, and let it all grow still, and carry with you down into sleep the image of those white mountains rising from the sand and the memory of the gentle king who built them 4,500 years ago, and who is remembered. Still, sleep well.